So tonight, it's really a senator's report back after just a few months in this new job, to be able to speak with you about some of my experiences, some of my thoughts, to ask a few questions on the theme of youth, peace, and power. And the way in which I come at this is the notion of global citizenship. But I often get the question at the beginning, certainly of discussions or classes, where students will say, is this a sham? Like, is there such a thing as being a global citizen? And in this world that we're sharing right now, you know, the fact that youth leaders are leaders for today, so often I hear people address young people, young leaders, and say, you are the leaders of tomorrow. No, you are the leaders of today. And in decades, we have never had as big a question mark hanging over the human race about how many tomorrows we may have to share with each other. And so part of my question to all of us tonight is about the degree to which and the ways in which youth leaders make a difference. I have no doubt whatsoever that the answer to the question is yes, but it's the how and with some specific examples. What you see here are recent pictures that have been taken. They've been taken in Ottawa, and the one to your far right was taken here in Winnipeg. And they relate to the fact that when I accepted the appointment as a senator, one of my primary reasons for going to Ottawa was to bring more of the Senate to youth and more youth to the Senate. And as a result of that, my team, which is also very young, in their early 20s, that what we've been focusing on is all the various ways in which we can facilitate coming and connecting with the Senate of Canada. On the eve of July 1st, Canada Day, we had 150 high school students that we hosted on Parliament Hill to meet with and talk with senators and have some open discussion. And again, on your far right, what you see is one of the youth circles. When I come back to Winnipeg or when I'm invited to other parts of Canada, usually there is an open youth circle. And that's a time when it is a circle, and it is a time for me to listen. One of the questions that I ask quite consistently is how youth leaders feel about the broken promise on electoral reform. And one of the other questions that I ask is, what about lowering the age of the vote to 16? Is that not something that makes sense for us as such a young country with a demographic that has so many young people coming into responsibility? Think about that. I'm actually seriously looking at introducing a bill that would look at this question of lowering the voting age to 16. And here you have, just this week, I sit on the Aboriginal Peoples Standing Committee at the Senate, and we hosted, you have a combination of youth from Nunavut with the senators on the Aboriginal Peoples Committee, and let me see if I can get the laser to work. There is our very own Senator Sinclair, and we have the chair of our committee is Senator Dick from Saskatchewan, and this is Senator Dennis Patterson from Nunavut. And you can see that the youth leaders that joined us are wearing their traditional clothing. And in addition to that, Senator Charlie Watt, who is here, along with Elder Turk from Nunavut, both addressed the youth in Inuktitut and were able to conduct themselves in conversation in Inuktitut, which, by the way, is not usually allowed in the House of Commons. And so when we ask ourselves about what youth leaders can do and what intergenerational cooperation can be about, I want to bring to your attention, those of you that perhaps haven't looked closely at the relatively new Sustainable Development Goals. There's supposed to be a 30-year plan here. And of these Sustainable Development Goals, I wanted to highlight this evening 16. I could as easily have looked at 5, which is the standalone Sustainable Development Goal, or SDG, for gender equality, because the failure of the Millennium Development Goals, which ran from 2000 to 2015, was largely attributed to the fact that there wasn't a gender-based analysis or an approach that understood that the living of rights, the ways in which war and calamities, disasters, just about everything that happens to us as humans does not happen in the same way to women and girls as it happens to men and boys. And that doesn't even get us into the discussion about what happens for us when we live in such an intensely gendered society with so little flexibility for those who are non-binary. So when we ask ourselves, though, what does it take to actually have sustainable development in a world where we have the bellicosity, for example, of the leaders of North Korea and the United States engaged in very dangerous sandbox language, that the implications of trying to mobilize our communities, our countries, and to work in a form of global governance that actually builds peace raises the question of how. And one of the single most important aspects of this for sustainable development of peace for our world is access to justice, and not just in the formal way. We have to look at outcomes. We have to look at not just the articulation of rights, but the living of rights. And in order to do that, although very often we use the adjective institutional as though it is something that's negative, the fact of the matter is, worldwide, functioning democracies need their institutions, and they need their institutions to be accountable and transparent and responsive. And this has a lot to do, potentially, with the kind of accountability that is defined by youth leaders from a very inclusive framework. When we're looking at the whole notion of building peace, what does this really mean? One of the single most influential Security Council resolutions is 1325. There's nothing special about that number other than the Security Council passes its resolution in chronological order. And so this 1325 was actually adopted in the year 2000. And since then, we have a suite of Security Council resolutions that have built up around 1325 and generally are known as the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. I chose this because there are very few women blue helmets in the UN peacekeeper forces. They are growing in number, and some of the work that's been done here at the University of Winnipeg has actually focused on supporting the women blue helmets and the nature of what they do when they are building peace. And trying to bring greater security. But one of the other really important aspects of 1325, and it's important when we're looking at whether or not we're building community peace or whether we're trying to contribute to international peace, the simple fact is that there's only one Security Council resolution that was actually drafted in the words and with the concepts directly from those affected, in other words, women. And in the case of 1325, most of the language, most of the drafting was done by women in the South who bear the brunt of conflict to a much greater degree than those of us who live in the northern part of the world. This is actually a picture that I took here on campus, just down the hall from here. And this was taken when we had about 30 women Blue Berets here in Winnipeg for a police conference, and used that opportunity to do UN training with them on a new policy that had just been developed in response to what was happening in the field. These Blue Beret women came from conflict zones where they are actively serving to Winnipeg for the workshop, and they then left here and returned back to those conflict zones. The focus of the policy was responding to sexualized violence in conflict, and that is often referred to as rape as a weapon of war. One of the things that happened in the confidential sessions that we held, where women were able to talk about what it means for them to be peacekeepers, and the fact that they themselves deal with sexualized violence within their own work environments very often. Or, as a number of them said, when they arrived for their assignment, they were told by the commanding officer to make tea for everyone. So the nature of this kind of work and the way in which, whether it's within the family or the community, or an international assignment, gender equality is a key and core issue for being able to move ahead. What we have in a more recent move from the Security Council is a Security Council resolution that, in addition to the women peace and security agenda, has now broadened that to a youth peace and security agenda. Here you have students from Global College. You will probably recognize the sculpture in the background, the massive gun which has its barrel twisted as a symbol of stopping violence, something that we've obviously done very badly at as a world community. And the tall gentleman in the middle is the first secretary to the Canadian mission to the UN. This picture was taken as part of a course that I used to teach here called the UN Study Tour. And here you have a more recent picture taken on the very first occasion when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau spoke at the United Nations and described himself to the world as a feminist. And these are students, again, from University of Winnipeg. I just have to say that we're halfway through the mandate of the current government, and there are lots of questions that need to be asked, and I'm very grateful as an independent senator that I get to ask many of those questions, and I want to invite people with concerns or suggestions to please open up communication with my office. I would really welcome hearing from you. But part of the point I wanted to make was that the broad smile, at least on my face in this picture, is because I've been taking students to the United Nations for more than 20 years. And I gotta tell you, the 10 years under Prime Minister Harper were rough. They were really rough because it wasn't a time to feel particularly proud of our leaders or to feel particularly proud of our country. There was so much retrenchment, there were so many things that we used to lead on that had to do with focusing on human rights and the building of peace that we just basically stopped doing as a country. Although I must say that in many ways the focus on maternal health was a strong aspect of the Harper years. And so what we're now looking at, what we're on the cusp of, I think, is this meshing of the idea of youth leadership and the women, peace, and security agenda, so that what we're looking at is creating alliances across age, across culture, across geography, across gender, with a focus on the intersection between peace and security. Peace being possible through the living of human rights. This is an example of local action which ended up having quite a strong international impact. What you're seeing is a postcard that was generated out of artwork done by a local Winnipeg artist. Take a look at some of the symbols. It comes out of something called the Feminist Toolkit on peace building. And this was initially developed with the Girl Guides here in Winnipeg to be used to build awareness at a very young age around the peace and security agenda and Resolution 1325. But now, where it's broadly used is actually in projects in conflict zones with girls who are learning to read and write. But the actual module is an adaptation of what was developed here in Winnipeg with the Girl Guides, so that the literacy is not on see Dick, see Jane, see Spot, but rather it's using the conceptualization of youth leadership and girls' empowerment as part of what is possible to do even in the midst of a conflict zone. And what you see here are pictures. This is the program called the Girl Ambassadors for Peace. We have some direct relationships, for example, with the South Sudanese diaspora here in Winnipeg that is connected to the work of the Girl Ambassadors for Peace program in South Sudan, which even though the program was forced to flee and they're all in refugee camps, they're still continuing to do the literacy work and using the materials in the refugee camp. So where does that leave us? Well, even more recently, September 21st and 22nd, last week, we had some additional responses at the upper level. And one of the things I want to be clear about with you is I'm not here talking about the Security Council and the United Nations because I think it's perfect or because I think it's the only place where we can build a more peaceful world. But the truth is, that we are global citizens. And the truth is that we do have a form of global governance that has lasted more than 70 years, and it was created to focus on peace and human rights. And although we have a lot to be deeply, deeply concerned about and scared about, actually, the notion that we can have an articulation at the world level, at the global level, as we did last week, in acknowledging the genocide directed at the Yazidi peoples. And in addition to that, acknowledging, using the formal terminology of crimes against humanity and genocide, and acknowledging the impact of the sexual enslavement of Yazidi women. And so, the way in which we're seeing, this is another example of this linkage between the youth peace and security agenda, the women peace and security agenda, and again last week, on your right, is someone you may already be familiar with, Nadia Murad, a young Yazidi woman who was sexually enslaved, who was able to escape, and in spite of tremendous difficulties in having to relive and be re-traumatized, she has been an advocate and an activist on this issue for years now, and has, over the last 2 years, had the direct assistance of the human rights lawyer Amal Clooney, who is seen beside her in this picture. This ties into the fact that there is a new Security Council resolution that actually acknowledges the extent to which the crimes against humanity are happening and are focused on women. We had a number of emergency meetings in Ottawa on Parliament Hill this week. They were directed to the Rohingya refugees that have been forced out of Myanmar, also known as Burma. And just a really quick historical note on this. For over 1,000 years, the Rohingya people, who are predominantly Muslim, but not exclusively so, they have a mix of cultures and religions within the Rohingya people. And in the Rakhine region of Myanmar, that what we are seeing is in just about a month's time, almost half, approximately 430,000 Rohingya have been forced out of Myanmar. And the majority of those forced out in just the last 4.5 weeks are women and children. And of them, 70,000 women are pregnant. Many of them pregnant as a result of rape as a weapon of intimidation, coercion, in this case, of forced migration. The photograph you see here is of a young Rohingya boy. What he's actually trying to shelter under is the tarp that has been made available to the families to try and protect themselves as their shelter. They get a few sticks of bamboo, they get the tarp, and that's about it. And what is clear is that although the level of awareness has broken through, because this didn't start happening just a couple of months ago, but the scale of it and the focus of it and the fact that a Nobel laureate is the state counselor for Myanmar and thus far has actually referred to, quote, fake news about the massive exodus from the country, forced exodus from the country, and even used a term such as fake rapes. So we haven't, as an international community, begun to respond, in many cases to respond at all, and when we have been trying to respond, not responding at the level of the scale of what has now been clearly defined as a genocide. And so you have one of our already most impoverished, most overpopulated countries that faces more disasters than many other natural disasters than many other countries. Bangladesh is now where these 400,000 plus Rohingya are trying to survive. It's a dire situation. And it is something that the world needs to have a coordinated response, and Canada needs to step up and do more. Nobody really disagrees with that. The discussion that's going on the Hill right now is what will that look like? This last photograph is taken again in New York at the United Nations, and this is part of a dramatization about the threat of nuclear war. Now, when this dramatization took place, it was before we had missiles passing over Japan, a clear demonstration that they could as easily be landing in Canada or the United States. This is the closest we are to nuclear war in over 70 years. And the picture I chose because it really, I think for many people, it's a sense of what could we possibly do. But I need to remind you of something. In July of this year, more than 120 countries were at the United Nations in New York and committed themselves to a new nuclear non-proliferation treaty. Canada was not even in the room. This is an engagement, this is a communication, these are questions that need to be asked of your elected representatives. This is an area of leadership for youth leaders and for leaders across the age spectrum to become engaged in, because this is about whether we have tomorrows. My last point is just a picture from travels that I think conveys a sense of tranquility. And I want to close by asking you to consider something. I'm not telling you to do something, I'm asking you to consider doing something. This is something that I'm very grateful to have learned from Indigenous elders in Africa as well as here in Canada. When I've talked with them, because I've worked with a lot of women in different places who've been under tremendous pressure and violence, and when I ask them how they continue, how it is that they continue to have the courage and the tenacity to be activists in the face of such terrible violence and threats of violence. And in their own way, what elders have said is that we're human, and we have to find ways to nourish ourselves in order to continue, in order to keep working to make a more peaceful world that is actually grounded in the living of human rights. And part of what I've learned from them is how important it is to look for the sweet spots. It might be a beautiful sunset. It might be a smile on a child's face. It might be a particularly lovely morsel of food that is of great pleasure in a moment. It's a moment. Don't get bitter. That saps energy. So please, in your own way, think of nourishing as part of being engaged global citizens and leaders. And on the table outside, this is just a symbol, but please feel free to take one of these little candies. And if you opt for it, think for a moment about the value of finding your sweet spots in the midst of our shared struggles. Merci, thank you, miigwech.